I'm Gene, and this is Perfect Flow. I'm a New Zealand-based athlete and coach focused on optimizing performance, health, and well-being. While I have a professional background in biomedical engineering, I've chosen to follow my more immediate passions for running, endurance, adventure, movement, nutrition, lifestyle, community, psychology, and personal growth. My goal in starting this podcast is to connect with bright minds to extract the information I need to live a life that makes sense and feels good, and share those conversations with others. Apart from your favorite podcast app, the best places to follow my work are perfectflow.nz, genebeverage.nz, and Perfect Flow on Facebook. Welcome back to Perfect Flow. Today I'm talking with Andrius Ramonas. Andrius is a trail runner in Auckland. He's been here for 5 or so years. He rocked up from Lithuania to study his PhD at AUT, and I'm of course interested to hear about his training. But I'm also talking to him because he did his PhD in low-carb, high-fat diets and their effect on performance. And I actually took part in one of his studies a couple years ago and found that really interesting and really painful. And I'm interested to hear about what he thinks of the effect of low-carb, high-fat diets and low glycogen in general, its effect on endurance performance and also high-intensity performance and a few other things there. So I think this will be a really good conversation about nutrition and running and training and just a whole lot about his background and his thoughts on the space. So let's get into it. Thanks, Andrius, for joining me for a podcast. I was in Torpedo 7 yesterday, and guess what I saw? I saw your Roams. So the product obviously launched, and we'll get into Rome at some stage, but I was hoping you could take me back a little bit further, because you're not from New Zealand originally. From a very small country that no one's ever been to. So can you tell me about your upbringing a little bit and when you first got into endurance running?
Oh, it's not so small country. I mean, we have almost 3 million people.
Really? Okay.
We're just really packed into small land. You can literally drive in 3 hours from one side of the country to another side. So technically it's small, and we have only something like 100 kilometers of sea or shore. So compared to New Zealand, it's really different.
Yeah, I've been to Estonia twice and to Latvia once, but we still didn't take the trip across because, of course, those countries are pretty much the same size. I think by land area as Lithuania, they're pretty similar. They're all pretty small, but you've got a lot more people in Lithuania. Wasn't Estonia like 1 million?
Yeah, Estonia is way smaller. I guess Estonia has a little bit more forest and more kind of wild places. I don't really know the reasons why Estonia and Latvia have a little bit less population than Lithuania.
For those who haven't been to the Baltic countries, do you want to describe the landscape a little bit?
Yeah, Lithuania, I mean, and all the Baltics, probably the main key thing is like we have lots of forest, we have lots of lakes, and some lakes are hidden. So we all kind of born swimming in lakes and running in the forest, and not too many hills, but there are still places to get lost and, have fun and have adventures. But I guess any, runner from the Baltics is good, is good doing trails or running fast through forest, but maybe not so good doing big mountain running.
So it's probably the opposite to Switzerland.
Yeah, that's completely opposite. Yeah, and that's why the first experiences of us, and my I can say my generation, because when I started doing more trail running, we were actually just a few runners, or my friends. And we were a bit of outliers and testing the ground and seeing how it feels to run like a proper mountains, proper alpine terrain, not only hike but like compete. And so that's how I guess it all started, from just a few tries. My first proper ultramarathon was in the Lake District in Britain. So it's still not, it's not Switzerland or European Alps, but I mean, the Lake District is pretty rough and tough terrain. And some of my friends tried a bit different races, and finally, after a few years, we met in the World Trail Running Champs in Connemara in Ireland. And I guess we were actually put in the really good context how it should feel, compete in the proper elite field, and we were totally demolished, but that was a good start. Every runner needs to be sometimes taught and shown what is good and what is bad and how to improve.
Yeah, there's a sort of humbling that happens that has to happen at the right time. Like, you've got to be kind of understanding and experienced enough to know that it's possible. You don't want to be just totally crushed and demoralized, but you do need some of those experiences, I think, where you realize that there's something you're missing. You haven't quite got there, whether it's the time or your training isn't hard enough, or you're not doing the right kind of training. Yeah, it's always good in your development to have a few big head scratching moments. I certainly remember them pretty clearly when I was younger also. So you took up running while you were in Lithuania, and how far did you take it before you moved to New Zealand, and when did you move to New Zealand?
Oh, I spent, I will tell exactly, I spent around 6-7 years when I started actually running on just doing road and track mostly. So that was like a college, university type years, and which now thinking back, I think that was one of the most valuable things that I actually got, because running skills and running fundamentals that you kind of gain through athletic training and the speed that you develop then later carries, you take that to trails and in any longer distances. And I think that enables you to improve quicker and understand better your body, and in general have more control over your training. So I, with my kind of road and track running, track was just an experiment. I wasn't really good on the track. I was ambitious, but not really good, and always was taught so many lessons on the track. But when I started doing roads, I felt a bit more confident, and I broke my best. I mean, I had my best road races, and getting close to 2.5 marathon felt good. That's kind of, you reach that level or that speed that feels great. And this is that moment where I took it to trails. And so New Zealand was still quite far away from this. I spent several years in Britain doing my master's, then came back to Lithuania and kept working. But eventually after that, I was looking for PhD opportunities, and New Zealand came one of the options to do sports science and exercise physiology degree. So this is
you had
what
studied a bachelor or whatever the equivalent is.
Yeah, I
did
physiology
or something like that.
I did my bachelor, or my bachelor was in medicine actually,
Okay.
and I did my specialty training in sports medicine. So I usually look at sports medicine and exercise physiology like a bit of a brother and sister. I mean, those specialties come close together. Maybe not in New Zealand, but in most European countries, kind of exercise physiology and sports medicine, they're really close. As a sports doc, you do a lot of physiology and that kind of work. So it wasn't that far for me to, was realistic to think that I can do a doctorate degree in sports science, exercise physiology.
Just jumping back a little bit
Yeah.
to the road and track experience, was it more the increased competition that forced you to get more specific and serious about the training, or was it the coaching that you received that you think helped up your game with distance running in general? What exactly do you think was the reason why doing road and track running was so beneficial for you?
I guess I was exposed to really a lot of great runners around me, and coaches, and really different style of coaches. And some of them were, I was involved directly, so they were coaching me and teaching, but others were around. So, and also, putting that extra layer of me being in studying sports medicine really helped, to establish, my networks of people that surround sports medicine. So, again, exercise scientists and different coaches and coaches from different disciplines. I guess I was just learning from everyone, and trying different things in my training, and not being afraid to try new systems, new training sessions, being open to learning various movement skills and exercises, and I think that really helped to progress.
Yeah, it's not something we see quite so frequently with trail running. People seem to meet up and go for runs quite often, but there's something different about the track and road training sessions. They seem to add a lot more surprising elements to a lot of their sessions. I found that quite useful, at least personally.
Yeah, it's interesting thing that trail runners sometimes think that they don't need that many, movement skills or practice running fundamentals, as if it's enough just to go and do trail running. I mean, to a certain degree, it is enough, if your goal is just to enjoy trails, and you can do this, but if your goals are competitive, you have to approach this a bit more from the fundamental running side, and incorporate running specific exercises, drills. And I always thought that if I would put some sort of a hierarchy of skills that you need, I would even put trail running in some cases on the top, because, first of all, you have to have just the general running skills, and then add complexity, running through different terrain, running uphill, running downhill, being able to change your pace so rapidly, because in road running you sometimes just stick to somewhat really narrow range of paces that you operate, but in trail running that's not the case. And nutrition is challenged way more, I think, because trail running races tend to be much longer compared to road races, though intensity tends to be sometimes lower. So I think trail running is more complex in that sense.
Yeah, it's like road running. It has maybe a smaller range of skills that need to be incorporated. So from that perspective, you might expect trail runners to do more of this training variation and more of these kind of alternative style sessions. But I think, most people kind of go with the 80-20 approach, I think, and just get volume on trails. Yeah. And I think that gets you a long way. But I think at the elite level, we do see, I think, a lot of people coming from a road running or track background that then apply that mindset to trail running, and I think just come from a better starting point, I think, and can really master it.
And they're really successful, and we have examples, and I think that's why they are breaking records and pushing the boundaries. I think trail running, it just needs a bit more time to allow those elite athletes to stay there, or attract more elite athletes, and we'll see records broken, and we'll keep seeing them broken.
Yeah. And when did you move to New Zealand? How long has it been now?
Oh, I think it's like probably 6 years now.
Cool.
Yeah, it took a bit longer than I was expecting, but I mean, I'm definitely enjoying my New Zealand experience, and still work on my PhD.
How many of the New Zealand runners did you know before you arrived here? You kind of just sneakily popped up at a few races and no one
Yeah.
knew, who is this Andrius guy and where is he from?
I really enjoyed that experience. I have to be honest. Like
To be unknown, the anonymous experience.
maybe I wasn't like thinking about this. I was thinking more about it's so cool to come to a new country and the country that is so far away and then get the first trail running experience, because any race that I signed at the beginning was completely unknown, and I had no expectations. So the two races that I did, my first two races in New Zealand, was one Tarawera 50 in the Redwoods, in Rotorua, and then the West Coaster from the Bethels Beach on the Hanger Walkway. And so two spectacular places, and I had kind of no expectation. I didn't know how trails will look like because I haven't seen even photos, so that for me was the most kind of interesting thing. You just go, it's a bit of jungle, it's a bit of river stream crossing, which I wasn't used to that much to running through water. And it seemed that each New Zealand race has river crossings and wet shoes running. But so I wasn't thinking, and I was in a good shape when I came to New Zealand, so it was just a luck that I was actually doing quite well, and I think that really helped to up my profile in New Zealand suddenly, and
everyone was interested in who this guy is and where he's been hiding for the
and
past
how
years.
long he will stay in New Zealand.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's definitely true that we have a lot of variation here on our trails. I think it's one of the coolest places to live, and I've had my own desires to move overseas and do racing overseas, but it's pretty hard to argue that there are better places to live if you're interested in running and exploring the outdoors. So it's pretty cool, and I think my feel from some of the Baltic countries and from the Scandinavian countries also is, although their forests are beautiful, it is all pretty similar. There's a lot of repeating scenery. And I think in New Zealand, we can just travel a short distance and experience something that's completely different, total opposite. And you can keep doing that and finding new terrains. So it's pretty cool place to be. And what was the initial topic that you were studying when you signed up for the PhD? And did it start here at AUT?
Yeah, I started and I'm still studying in the same place. So I had a bit of a shift in my PhD topic. So initially I was interested in what's called low carb diets and exercise performance. And when I say low carb diets, so it's a LCHF, low carb, high fat diets, and how exposure to those diets over a prolonged time can lead or can't lead to improved performance. And I had a relatively good start, but I wasn't extremely happy with the dietary control around those diets, and it was still a relatively new thing for New Zealand athletes. So
I think 6 years ago was kind of when it was just
kind of a start,
becoming popular in New Zealand, at least.
And
athletes, triathlon and Ironman guys were starting to do it then.
And athletes were still kind of learning to understand how you should control your diet, how you should stay in a chronic sense on LCHF. And I was not super confident in my kind of science and control of those diets in the research setting, which is more rigorous. You need to be really standardized and strict. So after several years, I had a bit of a break. I started working for High Performance Sport New Zealand. I had the opportunity to spend a year working with New Zealand sailing team, which was great just to experience, practical aspects of sports science in New Zealand in high performance environment, working with top level athletes. And after that, I came back to my PhD and I revisited my questions. So I still stayed within somewhat similar domain of nutritional manipulation, and specifically lower glycogen training, which is also achieved through low carb diets. But I'm more interested in how lower glycogen training and high intensity exercise performance does that, combination can improve your performance over the long time, so over the long period. So that's my kind of a new area and topic that I want to explore and keep working.
Can you explain the control problem a little bit more? For some of us with a scientific background, that's kind of obvious, but maybe for some others, it's less obvious.
Yeah. So the big thing, maybe I will, come back one step back and, just explain that to study performance or exercise performance is relatively tricky and complex, because performance, just imagine yourself as a runner or other athlete, going and doing your best 10 kilometer performance. Just think about about all the things that can influence your performance, that's this state of your mood, what you ate, even, what you did in the last day, week, or months, and hormonal status, sometimes environmental conditions, which we try to control in the labs and the controlled environment. So to show how any of the intervention will affect exercise performance is relatively tricky. So we have to standardize so many things and almost dissect and control everything that can affect performance, except treatment. So to leave an element of treatment as the key influencer of performance. So that means we try all the time to test at the same time of the day, to make sure that athletes eat the same diet at least a day before, that they restrict caffeine intake at least 24 hours before the study, though we know that the effect of caffeine on performance can last sometimes 2 days. But this is kind of a small concession or compromise that we can do. So striking a balance between research, design, and what we want to explore is really important.
So what kind of things are you controlling with the diet particularly? Because that's also hard to just put someone on a high-fat, low-carb diet. There's obviously variations in people's interpretation and also ability to execute on that.
Yeah. So there are different kind of approaches, and it really depends whether we are studying I will call it simple low-carb diet, when you just have a reduced carbohydrate intake during the day, or whether we are studying a more kind of extreme version of low-carb diet, which is called the ketogenic diet. So ketogenic diets tend to be really low in carbs, so that could be less than 50 grams, 40 or 30, going to extremes, or 10 grams of carbohydrates per day. That means that all calories have to come from fat and protein based.
Yeah. And just for some context, when I tried to do that, I was having to limit my salads. There was, I tend to have some big salads, and even that, when I added it up, I was like, oh, that salad's almost got 50 grams of carbs in it, and they're all foods that are not typically high in carbs. You wouldn't consider them high in carbs, but I mean, there's enough just sugars and things to add up.
Yeah,
it's pretty extreme. It's pretty hard to push someone. I can imagine it being really hard to actually execute a study when you've got to force people to stick to something like that.
Yeah, and there are different levels of control. And we have to, as scientists, sometimes acknowledge our limitations, given the dietary control that we will apply to a study. So I guess the the most rigorous scientific research with the dietary control is done in the labs where athletes are staying in the lab environment for the duration of the study, some sort of a training camps, and all the food is prepped for them in the specific kitchen and delivered in packets, and they eat only that food and nothing else. But this is extremely expensive and requires a big team of researchers, but I mean, saying this, it's becoming slowly more and more kind of a standardized approach, and big institutes are striving to achieve that kind of control. The next level that I try as well is controlling diet through dietary records and really kind of good recommendations, what to eat and what not to eat, what to avoid, and each product that athlete eats is recorded in the records, and we analyze those records. So it's not ideal sometimes. I mean, that introduces some degree of error, but depending on the research question, sometimes gives a pretty good estimation of what that athlete ate on a specific day or period, depending on the study.
Cool. Yeah. What are the studies you've been doing recently?
So my key studies are the one that is finished. So I'm looking how reduced glycogen, and glycogen is just a carbohydrate storage in muscles, the energy substrate that we use mostly during high intensity efforts. So I'm studying how depriving muscles from glycogen and putting or forcing yourself to do high intensity training in those conditions, whether that could improve muscle oxidative properties, or can that influence in a positive way muscle adaptations that could lead to enhanced performance.
Would you agree that that's somewhat counter to what the prevailing narrative within sports nutrition was prior to this line of research?
I think it's still pretty controversial, actually.
Yeah.
No one, all the current dietary recommendations would recommend, if you're doing any high intensity training, you have to make sure that your glycogen stores are full and you support that kind of exercise with carbohydrates. But there's at the same time a lot of research going on looking at the opposite polar effects, because there is enough research to show that training with lower glycogen on the specific days and specific scenarios can enhance muscle signaling, which leads to muscle adaptations. The only thing is that it's not enough evidence to recommend that systematically to athletes. So that's why research teams are working to understand better whether sometimes potentially compromising exercise, workout quality for the adaptations, is that a good trade-off? So
yeah, that's definitely how I was pitched for sports nutrition as I was developing. And I don't think we're saying that doesn't make any sense. But I think the first time I had a nutritionist who was advising me, and the first time they suggested that, hey, how about you do some sessions even before breakfast? I was like, no, high octane carbs. We need to be maximum fueled all the time. What is this? And he said, no, just try some things. You've got some. This was when I was just getting into some of the ultra stuff.
Yeah.
So my races were going to be at the distance when 2 gels was not going to cut it.
Yeah.
So we were interested in, what are some other adaptations we can get? And which is the foundation of sports physiology, is, you put a stress on the body and it responds in a certain way. But I was just so surprised by that suggestion, and then obviously looked into the whole thing, and there seemed to be all this very interesting research going on. And now, years later, I can say that, okay, there's something to it in certain circumstances, and there's definitely something to look into, but I definitely found it very counter to what I'd been told before, enough that I was like I felt pretty bad doing it. I felt like I was neglecting my future sessions. I had this like strong emotional attachment to always being maximum fueled. And I just developed that myself, and I kind of had this pride in always just that eating as much carbs as I could before and after. So yeah, it's definitely interesting when someone comes up with an alternative way of doing it that's being alternative way compared to what you've really bought into.
Yeah. It's interesting that you are not alone actually, because my colleague just recently ran a big survey, online survey around fasted training, and he collected responses from around 1,500 athletes around the globe, and found that approximately 60% or a bit more athletes do fasted training or incorporate that kind of training in their annual training cycle. So you're not alone. Athletes are doing this, and doing for different reasons. Some of them doing just because it's convenient, or they start early training. Others don't like maybe food before exercise, but others know and understand the science behind that and try to do that deliberately to push adaptations.
Talk me through some of the procedures that you go through with your testing, the glycogen depletion, and how that's important to testing the adaptations that you're interested in testing.
So to achieve glycogen depletion, there are different levels of glycogen depletion that we can achieve. And glycogen depletion, first of all, can be achieved through exercise and through diet. And the quickest way to achieve that is exercise for a prolonged time and preferably at high intensity. And then do not allow muscles or body to restore glycogen stores. So usually those glycogen depletion protocols are prolonged high intensity efforts, and there are different ways. I like somewhat steady type or workouts. For example, that could be 90 minutes or 100 minutes of running or cycling at moderate to hard effort, which is somewhat, and for runners that could be a marathon pace or half marathon pace. So it is a bit challenging. It's not an easy run. Sometimes glycogen depleting protocols also involve high intensity intervals, whether that's 1 minute or 2 minute intervals on the top of those 90, 100 minutes of moderate exercise. Probably the most brutal, I would say, glycogen depleting protocols are those that completely use only intervals during that session. So for example, you could do 2-minute intervals until you stop, until you can't do this, and that could last up to 2 hours of just doing 2-minute intervals with a short recovery, and keep going and keep going and keep going.
And
so
when do they pull the pin on that? When you are going so much slower than what you previously were, or do you tap out shorter and shorter each time? Because I imagine if you just allow the person to go slower and slower, then maybe you're not targeting the glycogen depletion.
One of the protocols that was quite popular and still used is, you set certain intensity, which could be something like a 90% of your aerobic capacity. So and it's high intensity, and you start from those 2-minute intervals. When you reach that stage where you're like, I can't continue, that intensity is dropped. So it kind of gives you a bit of a bonus, and then that means you probably will last another 10-15 minutes. And then when you reach that stage where you're like, I can't anymore, intensity is dropped even more. So, and at certain threshold, you kind of call it. It's like, yes, you are like now with low glycogen. Yeah. Now, to confirm whether you with low glycogen, the only scientifically correct way is to take a muscle biopsy, so small muscle tissue from your thigh.
So there's like a needle thing.
Yes.
They whack it and extract a little bit of,
Yeah.
of your muscle, your
Yeah.
precious muscle.
Yeah, and then that muscle is analyzed for muscle glycogen. So, but there are other ways in the sense that because over the last 80, I would say, not really 80, around 50 years from 1967, since we have muscle biopsy technique, we know that certain protocols will definitely lower your muscle glycogen. So sometimes this empirical information or experience is sufficient enough to kind of conclude that even without taking muscle biopsy, you almost certain that that athlete is with lower glycogen. So this is what I mostly use for my studies. In the sense, it's more kind of friendly approach because athletes don't like muscle biopsies that much. And I don't blame them, but as I said, it's sometimes enough just to know a protocol and run the protocol, and which will ensure that that lowers muscle glycogen.
What was the protocol you had me do when I was doing that study here? It was 90 minutes at, not sure what the intensity was specified as from your end.
It was 75% of your aerobic capacity. So 75% for untrained athlete, that would be something like a half marathon pace. For you, that's somewhat marathon, between marathon and half marathon pace. So it's kind of steady, slightly uncomfortable, but not easy running.
Yeah, it was slightly uncomfortable, and it wasn't a pace I usually train at as well. I found it was in this no man's land where I didn't have a good way to sense how it should feel. And I remember feeling far more concerned about that pace, and maybe there's a bit of it being on a treadmill that it's kind of out of your control. It was quite an uncomfortable pace. And then you had me do 10 times 1 minute intervals. And what was the pace or what was the intensity, the definition from your side?
Oh, that was 110% of your velocity VO2 max. So this is what we call, let me think how to describe this. So it's a percentage of, at certain intensity you reach your VO2 max, or what's called velocity of maximal oxygen consumption. So this is just a mathematical way adding extra 10% to pretty much push you into your anaerobic zone completely. And the reason for that is that those two parts of that protocol allow to deplete muscle glycogen in different type of muscle fibers. So type 1 are slower muscle fibers that have more endurance, and type 2 are those more powerful. So combining two types of stresses or intervals allow to deplete muscle glycogen or lower muscle glycogen in both fibers.
Yeah, certainly pretty tough, but I think you probably got there.
Yes.
Fairly quickly. 2 hours from feeling great to feeling absolutely terrible. Yeah, and what were you looking at in those studies, and any of some of the studies you've been doing to that one?
Yeah, so my main interest was to understand whether athletes, when they come with lower glycogen, the following day when they come to a session, whether lower glycogen will affect their running economy. So that's one question, to understand whether the running gait and running form changes when they're running with low glycogen. And the final question was whether high intensity exercise performance will be affected when athletes are with low glycogen compared to normal glycogen. So that study was finished, and interesting thing, what we found, one thing, running economy as is expressed by the amount of oxygen athlete has to use at certain intensity was not affected, which wasn't a surprising finding, but it was important to find this because most long-term LCHF studies, low carb studies, when athletes use low carb diets for weeks and months, show that running economy is affected negatively by adhering to those diets, and that could actually have a negative aspect to your performance. So we showed that acute manipulation of muscle glycogen within 1 day, that this will not affect running economy, which was important finding and really relevant finding for thinking about what kind of exercise you can do when you with low glycogen. And another important finding was that high intensity exercise performance was not affected between comparing low and high glycogen, though there was a small aspect of this finding. This is just the average performance times between two conditions. When we look at the individual measures or individual athletes, there was like almost 50% of athletes that performed better in high carb or high glycogen condition, but there were also around 50% of athletes that performed better in low glycogen condition.
They perform better at the high performance
high intensity
tests, the high intensity tests. What were the high intensity tests specifically that you were using?
Those were time trial performances. So athletes had to run 400 meters, 1500 meters, and 3000 meters all-out performance on the treadmill. So it's a race intensity, all-out efforts on the treadmill, which should challenge your metabolism and the energy requirements. So this study kind of opened more questions really for us, and to understand why some athletes tolerate so well, low glycogen state, metabolic state, and others don't tolerate that well. That's a part of research, finding something and informing yourself and others where we should look again, and I think this is a really topical question, and a lot of research will go into understanding individual responses to performance, whether you're with low glycogen, full glycogen, whether you use certain diets or certain ergogenic aids. The range of responses from athletes are usually quite huge, and understanding why some athletes respond in one way or another way, I think that's a kind of an open field which will attract a lot of PhDs will be written on that.
Yeah, and to extend that, why the same athlete might respond differently to the same tests at a later stage in their career. And I can easily imagine myself 3 years ago, not necessarily in your study, but I imagine I responded differently to what I respond now, because I've done different things, and it'd be really you're definitely seeing a better understanding of the individualized approach appearing now. When I look on the internet, you see a lot more people as opposed to just prescribing what the most correct single evidence-based answer is. You hear a lot of people now saying, well, maybe it doesn't matter what the average best answer is. Maybe we should be doing something more diagnostic as an individual. So does that kind of hit your research is pointing to a similar answer?
I guess my research it just gives a hint. I mean, I don't want to extrapolate too much, and make any conclusions. It just says that athletes responded in my initial studies.
That's right. It's not an answer to say, okay, we've sorted it. It's another question to say we need to go a little deeper to better understand the dynamics.
But one thing that we definitely see in most sports science and other science literature, first of all, authors and the researchers tend to disclose more and more individual results, which was not the case. Usually we would be dealing with a lot of average numbers. So now everyone tries to show or display in the articles, individual results, because they have value. And there are new techniques coming from the individual response perspective that, just to give you an example, usually every kind of simple research design would have pre-study and post-study testing. So we are starting and doing more often this kind of repetitive pre-study testing. So kind of trying to establish within athlete reliability or variation. So we're not only trying to measure the difference between pre and post measurements, but we are trying to account also for or natural variation in responses, whether that's it could be VO2 max test. Is there a variation? If we test 3 times and 3 times in 3 weeks the same athlete, and we find, let's say, 1% variation in that athlete in certain measure, or let's call it VO2 max, we can account for that change in the post-study testing. And if we'll find 1% change in the positive side, we can be like, no, I mean, that 1% change can be actually just a normal variation. And we know that. We can show that actually, because if you don't have that variation assessed before the study, sometimes you, as a researcher, you tend to 1% change in some sort of important measure. You can call it as a really important, finding. And you want to sometimes call it important finding, but maybe that's nothing. So I guess research designs are also developing, and we are trying to be a bit more rigorous and standardized.
Yeah, it's pretty tricky. You're the easiest person to fool yourself. Yeah. Especially when you're passionate about a subject and really interested in it. Yeah, I know. It'd be so easy. Have you tried any of the manipulations yourself in your own training over the years?
I think I naturally adhere to certain nutritional manipulations. I personally do long, slow training sessions with low energy availability. So that a good example could be, a 2-3 hour or even 4-hour run where I do not consume any energy during that run, just consume water to hydrate, maybe with electrolytes.
So no calories?
Yes, no calories, or calories without carbohydrates. So that could be higher fat, content products, but mostly no calories. But I also distinguish those. It's sometimes confused by athletes. It's not every 2, 3, or 4-hour run has to be done with low calories. Usually the most important element that kind of allows me to decide whether I should go with low calories or high carbs is the intensity. So if the run becomes intense, or I choose to do more intense 2 or 3-hour run, I would choose to do that with the carbohydrates to kind of sustain or support that intensity with
it kind of sounds like you're describing that manipulation as a training tool or a specific kind of session almost. It's not something that you're applying to all of your sessions. It's there's a certain right time to be using such a manipulation. Well, what other kind of manipulations have you played around with?
I tried fasted training, but I was never a big fan of fasted training. I enjoy having a bit of a breakfast. It could be a low carb breakfast actually. Eggs, avocado, and coffee, and it works well. Not for everyone, have to say. What else? I tried other manipulation, which is extreme. And from low carb training, it's training with extremely high carbohydrate intake. So And why that's done, it's to train your gut to absorb carbs. This kind of manipulation is really useful approaching races when you know that in races you will have to consume massive amounts.
So you're talking about consuming a high amount of carbohydrate during the session, or
Yes.
over the 24 hours doing
No,
high carbohydrate?
it's more like a couple of weeks before the race, during your final, let's say, long training runs or sessions, when you could almost think, oh, why should I consume anything? I mean, maybe they will be easy intensity, longer, but easy intensity. But this is a time when you're kind of approaching the race. You need to manipulate your diet and start making your stomach and guts more responsive and better prepared for a higher sugar intake. So even if the session is light intensity, I would still take plenty of gels and push every 30 minutes a lot of gels, or whether that's just carbohydrate based drinks, even if you don't want. But that's a good way to prep your stomach for the race.
How many grams in total, and how many grams of carbohydrate do you reckon you can get down per hour for a 4-hour run?
I'm not like in this research science, it says that you could technically push something like 80-90 grams if it's a correct formulation. But I'm usually I stop at somewhat 60 grams. That's my individual tolerance.
Yeah, I've got to 60 a few times, and it definitely felt like a ceiling.
Yeah.
I think the times I've got to 60 grams per hour at a training intensity was like just manageable, and the times I've tried to push to 60 grams per hour at a race intensity, I'm obviously not there yet.
Yeah.
Maybe I can improve my gut absorption a little bit more, but it just ended in the whole system stopped, the pipe stopped. It was even worse. I did a podcast with Sam Clark, and he on Coast to Coast could get 90 grams per carbs in the paddle. So there's a lot less bouncing. You're basically sitting still, drinking from a tube, and you can get 90. But then I think it was only 50 or 60 on the run, and somewhere in between on the bike.
Yeah.
So there is some other variations there depending on what the activity.
Yeah, and probably depends also on the combination of different foods and sources that you're consuming. I find that if I used to fuel only on gels, but that was my just personal kind of, I wanted to simplify nutrition, know exactly how many gels, but eventually I found that if you kind of balance a bit of a carb-based drink with some gel and some real food as well, that kind of helps to mix it up a bit, and stomach tolerates that a bit better.
Yep. Yeah, in some ways having like less fiber obviously sounds easier, but then something else happens with the gels, I think. For some people, they start feeling real sick when they are only having gels.
Yeah,
some people.
Gels are a concentrated form of carbohydrate. I mean, every time you put a gel in your stomach, you be ready. I mean, if you don't dilute it, stomach doesn't like it. It restricts absorption. And or gastric emptying. So and there are scenarios when gels will probably feel bad when you, for example, dehydrated and racing in hot conditions, because just a simple thing, all blood is shifted to working muscles, so stomach is kind of suffering. So I would take care of hydration more in those cases. So a good example, if it's a hot race and it's a long race, I would probably rely more on drinks with carbohydrates. If it's a cooler race and I know that hydration will not be an issue, maybe I will include more gels into my nutrition. And at regular intervals, I would take some natural food as well.
So is that as a way of ensuring you're not neglecting the hydration? You can still focus on getting the carbs in, but you're always taking them with water, so you're keeping the hydration going as well. Yeah, there's definitely some things to play around with. I've had some nasty experiences where I think at first I thought I had eaten too much. But then when all the rest of the dehydration symptoms set in, then it was possibly that had gone first. It was possibly that I was lacking in fluids in the first place, and therefore as you were saying, that the gut ends up being sacrificed first, because the muscles seem to be demanding the rest of the blood flow. What else do you play around with regards to nutrition more generally? Is there anything else that you've been interested in?
I mean, as part of my research, I tried obviously a low carb approach,
chronically, as opposed to what you're doing with these tests.
Just a couple of weeks of cutting carbs of your diet, and personally, I would probably stick to higher kind of normal carbohydrate diet. I just find it's challenging. Everyone knows it's challenging unless you kind of create a support system.
Challenging to stick to the eating as opposed to challenging for your training.
Maybe challenging as a eating, and I didn't find that particularly difficult for training, but again, this is like really individual thing. I find that higher or fitter athletes deal a bit better maybe with the lower carb diets. That's my impression, and I think one of the reasons is that fitter athletes are naturally burning more fat. That's normal adaptation that you acquire with training.
You said earlier there are two ways to remove your glycogen. One is obviously not eating, and the other is do endurance training. Helps quite a lot. So I imagine there is some adaptation that's occurred. Just from years of doing long runs, even if you've never even noticed it was possible to reduce your carbohydrate intake.
Some elite athletes are actually experimenting or doing without knowing already an experiment on themselves, like doing a double a day, twice a day training when it's almost impossible to restore glycogen so quickly between sessions. So so many athletes in the world, especially at the elite level, are doing natural experiment or manipulate diet.
I've got a theory that some of the adventure racers are essentially playing around with 5-day fasts. If you were to work out the caloric deficit for 5 consecutive days of on the move with 2 hours sleep, there's just no way
possible
you can
to,
eat. You can't get the carbohydrates, so they must be metabolizing their own fat. In a similar way. It's when you suggest a 5-day fast to them, they'll be like, no, that's crazy stuff. That's crazy stuff. But I suspect they're already doing the same thing at a physiological level. I don't think anyone's tested these guys yet, but I'm sure once we've got bored of testing trail runners, we can get on to some of these adventure racers who are doing 5-day races.
And it's a lot to test actually and explore, and I would suspect what we would see in those athletes, we'll see probably, first of all, higher fat burning capacity, and which is the result of lower muscle glycogen, which you naturally will lower during long, endurance events. Possibly some contribution of higher ketone levels, because ketones are the byproduct of fat oxidation. Potentially even a bit higher protein contribution to energy expenditure, which is still not really clear question. Like the science can't really answer how much protein is contributing to energy expenditure when you're in a low caloric and low glycogen conditions. So it's still not quantified really well.
Is that to do with the way the respiratory quotient is measured? You can distinguish between fat and carbohydrates, but you can't distinguish between carbohydrates and protein. I haven't really thought about that, but thinking back, there's been no answers. There's been no interest in that I've ever seen. I guess it's because it's just
so many studies done even with low glycogen training. When they assess substrate metabolism, they quote this thing that we assume that protein contribution is negligible, and which is not super correct, approach. There are some studies showing that there is increased amino acid breakdown when you're in low glycogen, low caloric conditions, but I think this question is not like how important protein is when you're with low glycogen. We still don't really know that well, and that requires some effort from the way to understand this is to consume protein which is labeled. That means treated so that you almost attach a little tags, and see where that protein and amino acids go into your body and how they excrete it. So then you understand how much of that protein that you consumed will go into substrate metabolism.
Right, and how much made it throughout the other end, which you can measure.
Yeah.
Right. Sure. So when did Rome come onto the scene, or maybe there was a predecessor, or when did that whole idea of having a gel that wasn't just 22 grams of carbohydrates come up?
So first of all, Rome is the company created by my partner and myself. So she's a like a mastermind behind Rome, and I'm kind of a sports scientist and represent that side of Rome. I don't think that that was a product of my research, not at all. I mean, we as trail runners, we both kind of felt like the market needs a bit more options, and not all training sessions have to be, just simple sugar. So we were just looking for something different that could be consumed during adventures, training sessions, as a healthy snack. Applications are really wide. It's only, we have started putting this into the sports science kind of context, especially myself, when I understood that Rome fits really nicely in the current sports science paradigm, which says that let's treat training nutrition and racing nutrition as completely different entities. When we are racing, we should take care of, getting sustainable, getting carbohydrates into your system that will help to sustain intensity and during your races. But when you're training, you should care more about adaptations. So sometimes those adaptations are related to training with lower energy availability without, stressing your system with carbohydrates all the time. So Rome, I think, fits there really nicely. That you can go for a slow session, and if you don't want to overstimulate your insulin and that carbohydrate digesting system, you can consume something which is in low carbs. And all athletes love a bit of a nutty or nuts, or products. So Rome is a almond butter based supplement, for your training session.
Yeah, with the convenience of a gel.
Yeah,
I think is the crucial bit, because we can all take like a peanut butter sandwich on our run, but I'm not sure if you've ever tasted a sweetie peanut butter sandwich or one that gets soaked. But there's obviously limitations around inconveniences around whole foods in tiny little ultra packs on long runs.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's, yes, it's convenient, and for athletes like adventure racers, that's also a good way actually to pack a lot of calorie dense fuel as well, or for trampers to have some, tasty calorie dense fuel, on their long missions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Is there any plan to expand it or do any specific sports performance kind of studies around the use of Rome, or are you just going to kind of keep it as that initial premise of having variation and convenience, that not everything has to be
Rome? I mean, Rome is just our first product, so we are definitely looking at developing several different products, and even though the first product is the nut butter based, we are looking much wider. We want to develop real food products for athletes. So other range or other products might be high in carbohydrates, but and more kind of performance focused and maybe race focused. But all of them we try to use natural, real food ingredients to achieve that, instead of looking at the processed and simple sugars.
Cool. Have you played around with it much yourself? I assume you were one of the first guinea pigs. Did you notice any comparisons with the traditional gels in terms of that pickup that it gives you, or does the fact that the carbohydrate content is lower, does it completely disguise that?
No, you should not expect any like energy kick from Rome. I mean, it was not kind of designed for that. It's
a high octane race gel.
Yeah, exactly. And I would not kind of try to replace or confuse this. And I tried that myself. I mean, it's perfect to balance it in training sessions. Like if you really like when I go training and I need kind of balanced nutrition, I want a bit of like a longer session, maybe at moderate intensity. I mix it up with the gel and then Rome and or consume Rome after the session or as a pre-workout snack. So there are no kind of strict rules around how you consume it during training sessions. But if you're racing, and especially racing at kind of high intensity, and I would kind of concentrate more on carbohydrates and leave Rome for more like training sessions and lower intensity.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. What else do you have coming up in the near future? I guess you've had a pretty quiet season, like most of us.
Yes.
Have you got big plans for 2021 or 2022 whenever we're back to normal?
It was really difficult. I guess even difficult kind of mentally be in the right kind of mental competitive space with all that uncertainty and keep training, because training for long ultra marathon, it just requires that consistent pressure that you put yourself, getting out for those long training runs and pushing some sessions harder. So it was definitely a tough time, but 2021 I'm looking to come back to Tarawera ultra marathon to race I guess the local Kiwis.
Possibly, 100 kilometers.
Yes, we'll focus on that. Maybe you will run as well. I don't know.
Hopefully, maybe.
Yeah. Also, I kind of want to concentrate a bit on some personal missions, and fastest FKTs, fastest known times.
Yeah,
and maybe challenge some of those. So kind of shift a bit of training from just only competitive side to like a personal competitive side, which kind of enables exploration of new places. And,
that's what I really like about those fastest known times is that you get pulled into some adventure that requires typically a lot more than what some of the typical trail runs would offer. You've got to get the routes right, and you've possibly got to do a lot of purely cross-country stuff on a lot of them, which I think is pretty cool. I'm also just holding to see what 2021 makes of itself. I think we've got some races in January that were downscaled for orienteering. They used to be Oceania, they're no longer Oceania. And that'd be cool if Tarawera is on. That would be great. And in theory, we've got Ultra Trail Australia entries still locked in there.
Yes, I have those as well. Yeah, true. Well. It's like that's the one that I might go if it's all open and going ahead. Yeah,
it's funny. We were so concerned about the bushfires, and we're like, oh, come on, and then it just got crushed by everything. It's certainly been pretty strange. Well, thanks, Andrius, for sharing those thoughts with you, and I hope the research continues to go well. I know there's a lot of us following the space, and there's a lot of advice, I think, for people to get interested at a personal level and actually stuck into their own experiments and playing around a little bit with their training, as opposed to just being interested in this stuff at an academic level or just as some interesting science to read. I think this is quite cool because people can get stuck in and actually test things for themselves, and try something that might help their training. So
yeah, hopefully, I mean, not hopefully, but this PhD will produce some sort of practical recommendations for athletes as well, so it will not stay just within this academic level. We'll try to translate that into practical things that athletes can actually use and in their training sessions.
Cool. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks to you.
If you're enjoying the Perfect Flow podcast and want more value from it in the future, there are some ways you can support it. The first is to rate or leave a positive review on iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or other platforms where it's available. The second is to share this podcast or specific episodes on social media or with friends. The third is to get involved more directly through the Perfect Flow page on Facebook, where I'm trying to construct a more interactive community. I want Perfect Flow to belong to the listeners, and if you tell me what topics you're most interested in, or even suggest specific guests, I'll do my best to make it happen. This is your opportunity to be part of something that answers your questions and adds value to your life. Another good reason to follow Perfect Flow on Facebook is that I post links to episodes, blog posts, and anything I find useful to this page. It's a great way to follow my training, racing, and learning. Another great way to stay engaged is to subscribe to genebeverage.nz. This way you will get podcasts and blogs emailed to you, avoiding the clutter of Facebook. I don't know where this project will take us, but the reception so far has been positive. Who knows where we might be in a few years.